Greetings from Australia. I'm Raewyn Connell, and I'm very pleased indeed to be able to say some words to the Ubuntu Congress, and I wish you all the well at this meeting. I'm a social researcher, and I have been involved in research about men and masculinities now for about 40 years. When I began work in this field, it was a very small, very marginalised field of knowledge. In fact, many people thought it was rather strange. Now it's a well-recognised international field. There are hundreds of researchers, there are special journals that publish research in this field, and attempts have been made to make its findings relevant to many fields of practice: education, health, social welfare, psychological services, and activism around gender equality and prevention of violence. We've learned over this period, we've learned a number of things about masculinities and about men's involvement in gender relations. We've learnt that there are multiple forms of masculinity. There is not just one single masculinity, but a range of different kinds which have connections with each other and sometimes oppositions to each other too. We've learnt that masculinities exist in different dimensions of life. So in some respects, they're related to economics, to the gender division of labour. In some respects, they're related to sexuality, different types of sexuality. In some ways, they're related to culture and are constructed differently in different cultures too. We've learned that social context is important to men's lives as it is to women's, and that the pattern of gender relations can be very different in different social classes, different ethnic groups, different nationalities and religious groups. These are all ranges of variation, not fixed patterns. And we've learned perhaps the most important lesson of all, that patterns of masculinity, men's gendered behaviour do change historically. And that is an important and encouraging piece of knowledge, I think, because it means it is still possible to change practice, hard as it often is in practice, but it can happen and does happen, and makes it possible, it makes it a practical proposition to think that we can work towards a more peaceful and cooperative world. There are problems in this field, of course, and you will be aware of many of them as much as I am. There's a huge problem of how to translate research knowledge into advice for action. There are problems in the field of knowledge itself, as in many fields of research. There is a tendency for knowledge to be organised according to concepts that come from the global north and come out of the social and historical experience of Europe and North America, but are therefore not always applicable in the post-colonial world, in the global south. And we've learned also that there can be resistance to progress in gender relations. There can be resistance even to the prevention of violence. And these are things that we have to think about very deeply. In fact, there has been opposition to this work from the start, 40-odd years ago. My research was under criticism, under political criticism from very early. This is sometimes a matter of what has been called backlash against feminist work of any kind. Sometimes it's a more passive, generalized defense of men's privileges, a feeling that men are entitled to be boss in the home or in the workplace, and that it's somehow against the order of nature if women should gain equal power. So there are different forms of resistance. It's something we do have to expect. One thing that concerns me, I think, is that the resistance has, in the last 10, 15, 20 years, gained some new dynamism and new ideas. So it has in some ways become more dangerous, I think. We've seen in many parts of the world the rise of a kind of authoritarian populism in politics, leading to national leaders who are, misogynist or simply heavily patriarchal. We've seen politics itself restored into a kind of power cult in quite a toxic way. And at the same time, and sometimes connected with this, we've seen kind of culture wars arising, sometimes from religious groups, sometimes secular, which are hostile to the concept of gender or gender relations. We've seen mobilizations in countries as far apart as France and Brazil, right-wing political mobilizations against feminism, against gay rights, against activism by men for more gender equality. So we're in a moment of history which is not easy to navigate. And when we have legitimate worries about the kind of world that this resistance, these anti-progressive movements will create. And we can see how their triumph would lead to a world with more fear, more insecurity, more hatred and more violence. And that's something we legitimately want to prevent, and which we should be pointing out to people as the likely consequence of these kinds of political trends. But we also have to have positive messages to give the people that we want to work with, that we want to speak to, whose help and participation we want to encourage. So what are the new directions that we might now gain, that we might now be trying to follow? I have 4 suggestions to make for your consideration. Firstly, that we really need an agenda which gives a very high priority to the concept of social justice. I think this is actually a more important concept than the concept of human rights, and a more general one too, one which resonates even with groups who have supported the backlash and authoritarian movements of recent history. Those groups largely want security, they want reasonable livelihood, they want housing, sometimes they want access to land, and they have every right to a fair share of our social resources in those terms. And I think progressive movements in gender relations must speak to those issues, must speak to the bread and butter issues of the economy, of security, of safety, of health and welfare, as well as questions of rights and identity. The second suggestion that I would make is about how to think of men's movement's relationship with feminism. And this has been a point of difficulty, obviously, as all of you will know. And there's much to be said for insisting on the notion of men's groups' accountability to feminism. But that itself can be a difficult concept. There are many forms of feminism. There have been many feminisms in the past, and there will continue to be different forms of feminism, I'm quite sure. It seems to me that the key, the thing that men's groups and movements concerned with men must above all achieve is practical cooperation with feminist movements. There can be differences of opinion and outlook and emphasis, but the capacity to work together, to cooperate, to coalesce in pursuing the common goals, that is the crucial thing in my experience and in my view of the way gender politics have gone. The third thing I want to suggest is the importance of decolonising our knowledge about gender relations, men and masculinities. Many of the concepts we work with do come from the global north, and they come, therefore, out of the experience of global north societies. But they can be very different from the experience of societies in the global south. They don't include, for instance, the experience of being colonised and of struggling out of a colonial situation into a post-colonial world. So there are reasons why we should be looking for the next generation of ideas, if you like to think of it that way, especially to the global south. So I would argue very strongly for trusting local experience, for emphasising the exchange of experience between different parts of the global south, and for looking to the intellectuals of global south societies for crucial concepts and ideas about how to develop this work. Because there is a wealth of thought as well as a wealth of practical experience. There's a wealth of intellectual work on questions of gender, questions of masculinity and men's roles too, in Africa, in Latin America, in South Asia, in the Pacific region too. And if we can develop effective means of exchange, of South-South exchange around these themes, I think we will be in a much stronger position in the future than research or international activism has been in the past. Finally, I want to say that the kind of politics we need is not all grim. I mean, we are dealing with some grim issues around health, around safety, around violence. We're dealing with issues of life and death, a significant part of the time. But we need, as well as a willingness to face those issues front on, we need imagination, we need capacity to think of better ways of living. We need humour and human connection in our work. And we need boldness, willingness to think outside the square, willingness to imagine, as I was suggesting, beyond present experience. There's a term that's become popular in progressive movements in South America particularly, the concept of buen vivir, of good living as a way of connecting environmental responsibility, social justice and humane social relationships. And I think that is a nice concept. And I would like to apply it to gender relations and to the concerns of men's movements. We need good, decent and cooperative gender relations. We need to do gender well. Good gender relations, I think, is the key to the progressive future that we all hope to achieve. And I hope your discussions in this event will help point the direction that way. Thank you for listening. I'm pleased to have been able to make this contribution, and I wish you well for the rest of your discussions.